And therefore, if what slate is wiped clean of and removed of that original sin, then potentially we might be paralysed. But then you've got an original sin problem, which no matter how this goes, I don't want to get to a point where original sin seems like a good idea, because it sounds like an obviously stupid idea. Today, for the second week in a row, I've managed to get through 2 whole chapters in one sitting. This is chapters 8 and 9 of the Gospel of Matthew. And this seems to take place immediately after the Sermon on the Mount, albeit I don't think you need to have the Sermon on the Mount as an actual event that took place, rather a collection of little bits pulled together in a sort of narrative sort of bit. This next bit carries on similar in the sense that it's all really short sections of very different things all sort of pulled together. And this seems to be the start of a second wave of a sort of healing spree, as it were. It talks about a chap with leprosy comes to Jesus to be healed. Jesus heals him. There's a lot of talk about being clean, which seems very Old Testament, but it's very un-Old Testament in the sense that in the Old Testament, all the miracles, you had to do stuff. People sent to the river to wash 7 times and all the rest of it, and throw logs into water to get rid of bitterness, that sort of thing. Jesus, though, clearly very different in terms of the stuff he delivers. He just sort of turns up, rocks up, says stuff, and it happens. So it's a definite change in tone that would suggest that Jesus is quite special and more powerful, certainly, than anyone who's come before him. There's talk about this fulfilling Isaiah 54-3, I think it was. That feels thin to my mind. It talks about Jesus bears our infirmities and takes them upon himself, which, kind of, but it doesn't seem to be that Jesus absorbs that disease or something himself or anything like that. So I don't know. I don't feel quite like that fits, but I guess he's still doing very clever stuff. We then have a Roman centurion comes to Jesus, seemingly with this remarkable faith that Jesus can heal his servant, even to the extent that he even tells Jesus that he seems to realise that Jesus doesn't even have to go to his house to do it. He can just say it and it will have happened. And it talks about Jesus is amazed by this, which is an odd word, isn't it, when you're God? I guess, written by humans in translations, and I assume if I look it up in lots of different translations, there'll be different words for it. But even if it was amazed in every single one of them, it's still a human writing about it. So how much that tells us. But it would be an odd idea, wouldn't it, for Jesus to be amazed? Actually, is that fair to say? What actually is the root of amazement? I think of it as sort of surprise. But, it would be very unlikely, I would think, that God, if Jesus is God, would be surprised by that. But there we go. Either way, Jesus is very pleased about this, so agrees and does this. Immediately after, though, we go into this quite difficult bit, which I'm going to read. So we're going to need the keeper of the book to get the big, beautiful birthday Bible. And chapter 8, verses 11 and 12 says, I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, and will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subjects of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. That sounds kind of heaven and hellish, isn't it? But originally, I remember first or second video, maybe I was saying, it doesn't seem that metaphorical now, but it's obviously it's gone up a massive notch, isn't it? So we've got people coming from the east and the west, which would seem to be people from other lands. So that would seem to be in the context of he's talking to the Roman who was a Gentile, i.e. not a Jew. So this is the first explicit, I think, healing or miracle that's delivered to someone who's not an Israelite. And then there's talk about the subjects of the kingdom, which I assume that's Israelites or like Pharisees, for example. Potentially that's covering them. There'd be, perhaps. And that they're going to be tossed out and wailing and gnashing of teeth, as it were, which suggests, I guess, in the hell question, that they're outside, so that's not annihilation. That does seem to be some sort of torment. But it does illustrate the idea that hell, or, it's been cut off from God. So, it feels like there's a lot in that, and it's, difficult to quite know what to do with it. But this stuff all just builds up as we go. It then talks about some demon-possessed people are brought to Jesus, and he casts out these demons, which is obviously very clever. I mean, I've seen The Exorcist, and it sounds like Jesus is having much less trouble with this than they did in that. But it's annoying there's no description of what it's like when someone is possessed by a demon. And there's got to be a line. I mean, some mad people who we might see now, you might think are demon-possessed. But are they demon-possessed or are they just mad? I don't know where that line is. It's going to be a bit of a theme of the New Testament so far, is not knowing where those are. But yeah, I want to know, does a possessed person look like the girl from The Exorcist? Don't watch that, whatever you do. Or does it look like Crazy Dave from down the road, who just talks weird and does strange things and shouts at people? Or is it someone who's just a terrible human being, like angry and violent or that sort of thing? Is that someone who's demon-possessed? I don't know, but when I did the Exorcism Tangent way back, nearly 3 years ago, the Church of England exorcism corner of their website was quite interesting. It does leave room for the idea that mental illness is a thing. It's not saying anybody who's having some sort of mental trouble is demon possessed. But yeah, again, where that distinction is, I do not know. Slightly problematically, it then goes on to talk about this chap who's Jesus asks him to follow him. He says, I need to go and bury my father first. And Jesus basically says, no, come with me. Don't know what the guy does, actually. That's a bit of a shame. But it does seem that there needs to be a sort of a renouncing of a lot of what we want in life in order to follow Jesus. And I guess if you tie that to the second part of the Sermon on the Mount video, that seemed to establish the idea that the standard of living that God envisages for humans is quite low, or quite basic at least. So yeah, that's a really difficult one. We then have Jesus and his disciples on a boat out at sea, and a massive storm comes along, and it's pretty terrifying apparently. So these fishermen, who are presumably quite used to storms, that sort of thing, are quite afraid. Jesus is asleep. He's just quite happily just chilled there having a snooze. And they come along fearing for their lives. Jesus comments that their lack of faith seems to be a bit of a problem. That's a bit of a theme, isn't it? Darth Vader and Jesus, they both talk a lot about lack of faith. Well, actually, no, technically, I suppose Darth Vader probably only said that once, I think. But, you get the idea. Jesus, anyway, gets up, just basically tells the storm to sod off, and it does. And it notes that the disciples are kind of struck by this. I mean, they've seen him do all these miracles and healing people and all the rest of it. And I guess that does make sense, that if you just tell a storm to go away and it does immediately, is that bigger than healing someone who's sick? And it's like, I guess it is probably, at least in terms of visual scale, that sort of thing. We then have two more demon-possessed men who are, so he talks about them being particularly violent. They're coming along. But interestingly, they seem to recognise who Jesus is and refer to him as the Son of God. So Jesus hasn't referred to himself as Son of God, but these demons have. They also seem to be quite afraid of him as well. And they're talking about, if you're going to cast us out, send us into these pigs or something, which Jesus then does. And then the pigs run down a bank or something and fall off a cliff and end up drowning. Yeah, okay, there's quite a lot going on there. Interestingly, the people of the local area seem to be annoyed at Jesus for this. And I guess, someone's lost some pigs, but you could still have soggy sausages, couldn't you? And presumably these two violent men hadn't just suddenly become violent when Jesus arrived. That had been a problem throughout, and Jesus solved it. So I guess there's a weird lack of context there. We then have another paralysed man. A paralysed man anyway, who comes along. And Jesus, instead of touching him or saying you'll forget, spoiler alerts, instead of touching him or just saying you be healed, whatever, Jesus says your sins are forgiven. And this seems to solve the problem. And that's interesting in the sense that suggests that this guy was paralysed because of sin, which is problematic. I mean, I'm a sinful person. We're all sinful people, obviously, and I'm not paralysed. And I'm sure there are some paralysed people who are less sinful than I am, I would have thought. And maybe it doesn't matter about the degree, but how do you work that? I guess potentially, as we are sinful beings, I suppose actually in that respect, potentially it turns or ties up to the whole idea of original sin, in the sense that we're all sinful, and that paralysis only exists in a fallen world because of Adam and Eve's sin, therefore the original sin, something like that. And therefore, if what slate is wiped clean of and removed of that original sin, then potentially we might be paralysed. But then you've got an original sin problem, which no matter how this goes, I don't want to get to a point where original sin seems like a good idea, because it sounds like an obviously stupid idea. I think the really interesting thing here, though, is that Jesus feels he has the authority to forgive sins. And I think this ties to an interesting part of the debate. You get some atheist objections. The Bart Ehrman, for example, I believe, will claim that Jesus never claimed to be God, which I think is reasonable. I mean, it doesn't sound like at any point the words "I am God" came out of Jesus' face. It's not like he turned up in a Lamborghini and just rocked up doing what he wants and just tells everyone to start off because he's God and he can do what he wants. But it's this idea that if you come down and presume that you can forgive sins, then I believe that's the blasphemy that gets him executed. Spoiler alerts. Which, yeah, guys, it's not an explicit "I am God," but it does seem to at least put into the argument that Jesus is special and knows he is special. So, yeah, perhaps it's another leap further to get to God. But I guess there's degrees. I mean, he's clearly more special than Elijah and Moses, Abraham and all that. But, yeah, how high does that scale go, I suppose? We then have the recruitment of Matthew the disciple, as in the guy who wrote this book, allegedly. And I believe this is debated. I think Christianity likes to sort of traditionally hold that this is the guy. It seems that's not a slam dunk, and I guess there's the problem in the fact that he is referred to here in the third person. So in the way it's written, it's not even claiming that it's him. It's a different one because, you might think, oh, well, the first 5 books of the Old Testament are supposed to be written by Moses, and Moses is referred to in the third person. But I think if you were being reasonable, you'd have a hard time actually arguing that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament back when Moses was supposed to have lived in like 12, 13, 1400 BC. So, yeah, I don't think that argument would really help anyway. But Matthew, anyway, regardless of whether he's the author or not, he is a tax collector, which is to say a baddie, apparently, in this context, which is quite funny. And the way it tells the story here is Jesus just comes along and says, yeah, follow me. And he just does. So it's like, right. And that's one of the interesting things about the Chosen, actually. I mean, granted the context that they make up, don't they? They put the biblical stuff within a framework that they have come up with themselves. And it's almost guaranteed to be wrong, the bits around there. But it does give you a context that just makes the rest of it more accessible, I think. And it does seem to be the strength of the Chosen, I think, just that accessibility. But Matthew goes with Jesus anyway, and then Jesus goes to have dinner at Matthew's house, and there's loads of other sinny type people there. And a Pharisee comes along and asks Jesus, like, why are you hanging out with all the riffraff and the bad dudes? And Jesus has this brilliant answer, which I'm going to read to make sure I get it right. He says, it is not the healthy who need a doctor. And then he refers them to Hosea chapter 6, verse 6, which talks about that I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Jesus then goes on to say that I have come to call the sinner, not the righteous. And that's interesting because surely there aren't any righteous people. I would have thought we've quite well established in the Bible so far that there is no one who is sinless other than Jesus. So, yeah. And I guess the Pharisee is presumably a sinner in this context. So I guess he's just, one thing at a time, man. Come on. But, yeah, there's more interesting bits. Jesus then asks also why his disciples don't fast. And Jesus seems to suggest it's just because it's party time, man. It's because I'm here and we're doing stuff, we're having fun, and morning will be later. So I guess our first foreshadowing of what's to come. He also refers to himself as the bridegroom, which is interesting. Because I guess that's, part of an entity that's a union of more than one individual, something like that. So perhaps Trinitarian to some degree. Don't know. It then gets even more complicated, which I'm going to read because there's quite a lot in this, I think, and it's going to be tricky. But I think it might be linked sort of mechanically with what salvation does or is. So in chapter 9, verses 16 and 17, this is relevant to why the disciples aren't fasting. Jesus says, no one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch will pull away from the garment, making the tear worse. Neither do people pour new wine into old wineskins. If they do, the skins will burst, the wine will run out, and the wineskins will be ruined. No, they pour new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. It feels like there's something, like a massive clue there as to what salvation is, how it works, all the rest of it. And I don't quite get it yet. I think I need to just ponder on that a little bit more. But yes, something has to be changed before you can put new stuff in, or something like that. I don't know if that's Jesus saying that that's what he's here for. Don't know. We'll carry on anyway and see if that becomes a bit clearer. We're nearly there. We then have a double miracle. Jesus on his way to see a girl who we're told has died. And there's a woman who talks about who's been bleeding for 12 years, just touches his cloak and is healed by this. And she then says to Jesus that she knew this is what would happen. And Jesus says that by your faith you are healed. So, yeah, I guess that's a good example of this whole idea that it's faith that you need to get into heaven, as it were. It's a different. I guess for her, it's a bit of a more tangible thing, isn't it? There's a guy there. I mean, I guess she had that faith, but she heard about all these miracles going on around that Jesus kept telling people to keep quiet, and they didn't. So I don't know. I don't think that's quite as straightforward. Jesus, anyway, carries on to go to see this girl who has died. People laugh at him, apparently, but he walks in there, helps the girl up, and they walk out, and everything's fine. It says then that the news of what Jesus is up to then travels far and wide. Although, oddly, just after that, it talks about Jesus healing a blind man who Jesus asked to then don't tell it, or a blind mute man, sorry. And Jesus then asked this guy, don't tell anyone about this, which seems a bit sort of stable door, horses bolting. But I guess it could be out of sequence or something like that. And then finally, the last interesting point is that the Pharisees implicitly acknowledge that Jesus is doing miraculous things. They accuse him of doing it by the power of demonic things, which, how do you cast out a demon with a demon? I guess a worse demon, maybe. But yeah, it's interesting they do acknowledge that he is doing super duper things, and we've not had anyone doing that before. So I don't know if the implication is that the Pharisees are stupid, something like that. Anyway, great stuff. This is definitely a theme, that there's so much stuff that we need to pick up and deal with, but fortunately each bit of the puzzle goes in, and hopefully we're going to get to something useful at some stage soon. But on we shall go to see what's next.